Hello everyone, and welcome to my YNR official 24 channel. Nikki's hands were still trembling when the smoke from the gun finally stopped curling into the air, hovering between her and Victor like a ghost that refused to drift away, sealing the moment in a haze that neither of them could yet comprehend, and as Victor staggered backward, the weight of what had just happened anchoring him to the floor like gravity had suddenly multiplied. He looked up at her, not with anger, not with fear, but with a shock so profound that it hollowed out his voice, leaving only the cracked whisper of a man who had spent decades believing himself untouchable, a man who never imagined that the person who would finally cross that line would be the woman who had stood by his side through betrayals, resurrections, reconciliations, destructions, and rebirths, the woman who knew him better than anyone else alive, the woman he had always assumed would forgive anything, even the sins he never confessed. Why shoot me, Nikki? But Nikki could barely hear the words over the rushing in her ears, the roar created by adrenaline and heartbreak and the horrifying certainty that the moment she pulled that trigger, she hadn't simply shot Victor Newman, she had shattered the last remaining illusion of the man she once loved, because everything had changed the moment she found that USB drive, the small metallic rectangle that had slipped through so many hands unnoticed, a piece of evidence that should never have existed, a digital time bomb stuffed into a decorative desk drawer she never would have searched had she not sensed something terribly wrong, something darker than his usual secrets, darker even than the betrayals she had learned to survive. She had felt it in the way Victor avoided her eyes the last few weeks, in how he dismissed the word trust as though it were a child's toy, in the late-night calls she overheard through half-open doors, spoken in a tone she recognized from the worst years, the dangerous years, the years when Victor believed rules were for other people and consequences were inconveniences that could be bought, buried, or erased. She had found the USB by accident or fate. She no longer believed in coincidences, nestled beneath a stack of invoices that didn't matter, protected by nothing, as though even the universe wanted her to know the truth before it was too late, and something inside her told her not to wait, not to ask questions first, not to give him a chance to lie. Because she already knew the scent of a lie from him as intimately as the scent of his cologne, and so she slipped the USB into her pocket, her fingers closing around its sharp edges like she was gripping a blade, carrying it with her into the sitting room where she opened her laptop and inserted the drive, bracing herself for, she didn't know what, something dramatic, something explosive, but nothing could have prepared her for the avalanche of documents, recordings, transactions, confessions, and digital fingerprints that leapt onto the screen, each file a doorway into a version of Victor she wished she had never seen, a version of him who crossed lines not even he should have crossed, a version who manipulated, threatened, bribed, and silenced, leaving behind a trail of devastation disguised as business strategy. And as Nikki clicked deeper into the labyrinth, her breath catching in her throat, she realized this wasn't just another ego-driven scheme or ethically gray decision. This was criminal, dangerous, monstrous, the kind of thing that couldn't be swept under the rug with apologies, diamonds, or his infamous charm. This was a man operating without limits, a man playing judge, jury, and executioner, a man she suddenly realized she did not recognize. And yet she wanted so desperately not to believe it that she whispered aloud, "This can't be real," as though saying it would make the files disappear, would revert her life to the simpler pain of being disappointed by him instead of being horrified by him. But every click brought her face to face with another deed, another recording, another signature sealed with his power and ruthlessness, and by the time she reached the folder labeled N, she felt her stomach drop in a way she had not experienced since the darkest moments of her life, for inside that folder were files of her struggles, her weaknesses, the secrets she told him in confidence, the memories she confessed in sobriety, the slips she admitted during relapse, all catalogued and analyzed like weapons he could deploy if she ever became a liability. And that was the moment something inside her cracked, something sacred she thought would never break, because he had promised he would never use her demons against her. Promised he would protect her from the world, not protect himself from her, but the evidence was right there, her decades of vulnerability stacked neatly in digital folders named with cold precision, and for one long terrible moment the world around Nikki seemed to tilt, like gravity had abandoned her entirely, and she stumbled toward the bar cart, old habits echoing through her muscles. But she grabbed the edge of the table instead, squeezing it so hard her knuckles turned white, grounding herself, reminding herself she was stronger than that, reminding herself that this moment, this betrayal, would not break her sobriety, but something else would have to break instead. She didn't know when she picked up the gun, she simply knew that the next moment, she was standing in front of Victor in his office, the USB clenched in her fist like a final verdict as she demanded he explain himself, demanded he choose truth for once in his life. But instead he smirked, as though she were overreacting, as though his crimes were business strategies, as though she should understand, as though she should support him, and he reached for her arm to steady her, to calm her, to manipulate her into submission, but Nikki jerked away, her voice trembling with betrayal as she told him she had seen everything, absolutely everything, and for the first time in decades, Victor Newman, the man who faced down lawsuits, federal agents, enemies, and death itself, looked genuinely cornered. He started to explain, of course he explained, because Victor always believed he could talk his way out of anything, but every word dug the knife deeper, every justification confirming the truth that he had not simply crossed a line, he had obliterated it, and the worst part was that he thought she would stay, that she would love him through this the way she had loved him through all his past sins, never understanding that this time, he had betrayed not just the world but her, and something inside her snapped with a clarity she had never felt before, a clarity sharp enough to cut, and the gun lifted as though pulled by gravity's cold hand, and Victor's eyes widened, and she heard herself say, not shout, not scream, but say in a voice that trembled with the weight of 1,000 unspoken heartbreaks, you left me with no choice, and before she could exhale, the gunshot exploded into the room, shattering the silence, shattering the past, shattering everything she thought she knew about love, loyalty, and survival. Now, with Victor bleeding on the floor, staring at her like she had become the monster in the story instead of the victim, he asked that impossible question, the question that carried a lifetime of shared history and shattered trust. Why shoot me, Nikki? And the truth was that she didn't know how to answer him, not because she didn't have reasons but because she had too many, because the betrayal was layered and suffocating, because the evidence on that USB had rewritten everything she believed about him, because when she looked at Victor Newman now, she didn't see the man she married, she saw the man who had planned for every possible betrayal except hers. Nikki stared at Victor as he clutched his shoulder, not mortally wounded but shaken in a way she had never seen, shaken in a way that made her wonder if maybe, just for one fleeting heartbeat, he finally understood the enormity of what he had done, understood that the bullet was not fired out of hatred or vengeance but out of desperation, the kind of desperation that builds over years, layer upon layer, until it finally erupts with enough force to destroy everything around it, and as she stood there, the gun slowly lowering in her hand, her breath caught between panic and clarity, she realized that even now Victor was trying to control the narrative, trying to twist her emotions, trying to fit this moment into the familiar pattern where he was the misunderstood titan and she was the fragile wife acting irrationally, but she refused to let him define this moment, refused to let him rewrite what she had seen on that USB drive, refused to let him paint her as the villain in a story where he had orchestrated every shadow, and she told him, her voice trembling yet sharp as glass, that she had spent years ignoring the instincts that told her something was wrong, years believing the best of him because she needed to, because the idea that he was capable of the horror she discovered felt like admitting her entire life had been a lie, but that USB had stripped her illusions bare, exposing not just a crime or two, not just a morally gray decision here or there, but a sprawling web of manipulation that touched the lives of people she cared about, people he claimed to protect, people he claimed were part of his empire even as he pulled strings that ruined them, controlled them, silenced them. She confessed that she had seen bank transfers to offshore accounts linked to shell companies she recognized from scandals he had sworn he had not been involved in. She had seen audio recordings of conversations where Victor orchestrated threats, blackmail, and emotional leverage. With the cold precision of a surgeon operating without anesthesia, she saw contracts that were signed with names of people who were dead or missing, and worst of all she found images, coded, encrypted, and stamped with timestamps that matched nights Victor had claimed to be overseas, images of situations that went far beyond business strategy and dipped into orchestrated setups, the kind that put innocent people in danger while Victor played puppeteer from the shadows. And as she spoke, Victor tried to stand, tried to regain control of the room, the situation, the narrative, but the pain in his shoulder forced him back against the desk, and the look he gave her was not the look of a man who was sorry or repentant or even frightened. It was the look of a man calculating, processing, measuring her words not for their emotional truth but for the tactical advantage they might give her. And she hated that look, hated that even now he refused to be vulnerable. Refused to show the humanity she once believed lived inside him, refused to acknowledge the damage he had caused not just to his enemies but to the people he claimed to love most. The room felt smaller, the walls inching closer as the weight of what she had done settled over her. Not regret. No, she did not regret pulling the trigger. She regretted that the situation had escalated to the point where she felt she had no choice, but rather the realization that she had crossed a line she could never retreat from, and she told Victor that the killing blow hadn't been the crimes themselves, as horrifying as they were, but the folder labeled with her name, the cold clinical documentation of her darkest moments, her struggles, her relapses, her grief, her fears, all categorized and analyzed like a case file Victor planned to use one day if she ever stood in his way. And when she said this, Victor's face shifted, barely, but enough, and for the first time she saw something flicker behind his eyes, something that might have been guilt or might have been irritation at being caught, and she didn't know which was worse. She told him she had loved him, that she had forgiven him more times than she could count, that she had rebuilt herself time and time again after he shattered her trust with the promise he would never do it again, but this time was different. This time wasn't a mistake or a scheme gone too far. This time was deliberate, calculated, premeditated, and the moment she saw her own life dissected within those digital folders, she understood that Victor Newman did not trust anyone, not even her, not even after decades of marriage, and the heartbreak of that realization was more painful than the recoil of the gun, more painful than the echo of the shot still vibrating through her bones. Victor tried to speak again, his voice hoarse yet steady, insisting that everything he had done was to protect the family, to shield them from threats they didn't even know existed, and he claimed that the files about her were merely safeguards, contingency plans, precautions in case someone ever tried to use her vulnerabilities against him, but the words rang hollow, cracked, false. Because a man who truly loved someone did not catalog their pain for leverage, did not store their private battles like ammunition, did not create an archive of their suffering just in case it became strategically beneficial someday. And when she said this, Victor's jaw tightened in frustration because Nikki had finally stepped outside the script he had rehearsed for years, a script where he could always explain, always manipulate, always charm his way back into absolution. The silence between them thickened, swirling with a lifetime of unspoken truths, and Nikki felt the tears she refused to shed burn behind her eyes, tears she would not give him, not now, not after everything, and she turned away from him for a moment because looking at him felt like facing a ghost of the man she loved, similar enough to see the resemblance, different enough to break her heart, yet when she looked back, Victor was staring at her with something like sorrow, something like loss. Something that might have been love if she didn't know how his attachments often twisted into control, and he whispered her name, Nicole, the name he used only in moments of deep emotion, hoping it would reach her, hoping it would soften her, hoping it would remind her of the years they survived together, but she steadied herself and reminded him quietly that invoking their history didn't erase the present, didn't undo the crimes, didn't dissolve the betrayal embedded in every kilobyte of that USB. She told him she shot him not to kill him but to stop him, to shock him, to force him to face the consequences he had spent a lifetime avoiding, because talking to him, reasoning with him, confronting him, none of it worked anymore, none of it ever truly worked, because Victor did what Victor wanted until someone or something stronger intervened, and she had realized with devastating clarity that she needed to become that force, that immovable wall, that undeniable consequence. She told him she shot him because she needed him to feel something real, something sharp, something immediate, something he couldn't buy his way out of, couldn't strategize around, couldn't manipulate into advantage. She needed him to feel pain, not out of cruelty but out of necessity, because pain was the only language Victor Newman still understood. And as she said this, Victor closed his eyes, perhaps in shame or in rage or in resignation, and when he reopened them, there was fire there. The fire she had seen when he battled corporate enemies, the fire that made him powerful and dangerous, but now that fire was directed at her, and Nikki felt a chill run down her spine because she knew that look, she had witnessed it destroy people, And a part of her feared she had awakened the version of Victor that could not be reasoned with, could not be softened, could not be redeemed, but she refused to back down. She stepped closer, her voice steady as she told him she was done being his shield, his excuse, his alibi, his blind spot, done closing her eyes to the truth because loving him had become synonymous with lying to herself, and now she had the proof, the digital confession he never expected her to find, and she would not hide it, would not bury it, would not protect him from the fallout. She told him she would turn the USB over to the authorities if she had to, that she would testify if it came to that she would not let him drag her or their family into the darkness he had created, and Victor's body tensed at the threat, his breath hitching with a mixture of hurt and fury as he murmured that she didn't understand, she couldn't understand, that what he did was necessary, that the world he operated in required sacrifices, demanded ruthlessness, punished weakness, and Nikki shook her head, her heart twisting because he still didn't get it, still didn't understand that she wasn't asking him to be weak, she was asking him to be human. She moved to the desk, snatched the USB where Victor had set it moments before she confronted him, and held it tightly, her fingers curling around it like a lifeline, and she told him the truth he had never wanted to hear, that he had lost her long before she pulled the trigger, that the moment she saw her life dissected like a weapon in his files, she realized she was not his partner but his liability, his possession, his asset, and she would not live like that, not anymore, not ever again. Victor's breath shuddered, and for a moment his face cracked, truly cracked, revealing the broken man beneath the empire, the man who feared losing her more than losing power, and he whispered again, "Why shoot me, Nikki?" as though the question haunted him, as though he needed an answer that might rewrite what had already been done, and her voice softened, not with forgiveness but with exhaustion, as she whispered back that she shot him because she was afraid of what he had become, afraid of what he might do next, afraid that if she didn't stop him now, something far worse would happen to someone innocent, maybe even to her, maybe even to their children or grandchildren, because once a person justified darkness in the name of protection, there was no limit to how deep they could go. And as the sirens began to wail in the distance, whether summoned by neighbors who heard the gunshot or by Victor's silent alarm she didn't know, Nikki lowered the gun fully, her hand trembling again now that the adrenaline was fading, and she looked at Victor with a sorrow that eclipsed every heartbreak she had ever endured and told him the truth he had earned, the truth that would echo through the rest of their lives. "I didn't shoot you to kill you, Victor. I shot you to wake you up." Victor inhaled sharply at her words, the sirens growing louder, echoing off the walls like a countdown neither of them could stop, and Nikki watched the realization flicker through him, that this moment, this confrontation, this shot, would split their lives into a before and an after, and nothing he said or did could restore the world as it had been mere hours ago. She could see him calculating again, always calculating, wondering whether to plead, to threaten, to manipulate, to bargain, but something in her expression must have told him that the old tactics would not work this time, not on the woman who had just broken the cycle by doing the unthinkable. She saw the struggle in his eyes as pride and love clashed violently, and for a fleeting, heartbreaking moment she wondered who he might have become if he had ever learned how to choose vulnerability over control. But choices had been made, files had been stored, lines had been crossed, and the truth was written in blood on the office floor. Nikki tightened her grip on the USB, her pulse still racing as the weight of what came next settled over her, heavy and suffocating. She imagined the officers bursting through the door, imagined the questions, the headlines, the fallout, but more than that, she imagined the way Victor would spin this, even wounded. Would he paint her as hysterical, claim she misunderstood, claim she was unstable, use those very files against her to rebuild his empire of power and perception? The thought ignited something inside her, a spark of resolve that burned away the last remnants of doubt. She stepped closer to him, her voice hushed but razor-sharp, reminding him that she knew exactly what he was capable of and that no matter what story he tried to construct, she would no longer be silent, would no longer stand as the elegant shadow behind his throne, because she had seen the truth and survived it, and now she would speak it. Victor opened his mouth to protest, but she lifted her hand, not with the gun, but with the authority he once claimed she lacked, and he stopped, his mouth closing in a tight line as his gaze dropped to the floor. She could see him wrestling with the unfamiliar sensation of losing control, of being held accountable by the last person he ever expected to defy him, and for a moment, a fragile, quiet moment, he whispered, "Nikki. I never wanted to hurt you," and she believed that, in a way, she believed he loved her in the only manner he knew how, fiercely and possessively, like a priceless artifact he wanted to protect but never truly saw. She told him softly that love without honesty was just another form of control, another weapon he wielded with practiced ease. The sirens stopped outside the building, doors slammed, footsteps thundered toward them, and the world began to shift with unstoppable momentum. Nikki took one last look at Victor, her husband, her heartbreak, her warning, and whispered that maybe one day he would understand why she did this, why she had to be the one to stop him when no one else dared, and then she stepped back, allowing the future, messy, painful, uncertain, to rush in through the doorway as officers shouted commands from the hall, their voices sharp and urgent, a stark contrast to the quiet devastation between the two of them. And as Victor straightened as much as his wound allowed, preparing to face the consequences he could no longer outrun, Nikki breathed a slow, steady breath, clutching the USB like a truth she would never again bury.